go to the content browser and somewhere in here make a new blueprint. It doesn't really matter where. I'm just going to do it in, actually I'm going to make a new folder in the blueprints folder called examples. And in there I right click on the space on the right here, create new blueprint. And then it asks you to pick a parent class. This is a bit more advanced. I'm not going to go too in depth in this right now. I usually just use actor. So usually when you don't know, simply use actor. It's the most neutral, most default one. So this works for pretty much anything. So I'm going to use actor and I'm going to call it door for tutorial actually. There we go. So now we have a blueprint that's separate. It's saved within this single object itself. You can easily send this to a team member, for example, he would have the same script. It's no longer in the level blueprint. And when you have these kind of assets, I'll save it very quickly first, you can double click them and it will open this. You can see you have three big buttons here: defaults, components and graph. Defaults are just the default properties, in the same way that clicking on an object in the world displays a bunch of properties on the right over here. The graph is similar to the level blueprint. You can see this is still the level blueprint I have open here. This is the graph for the object I made. And you have components. And components is a big difference between this and the level blueprint. You don't have components in here. And components basically allows you to add different sub-objects or sub-meshes, particles, lights, all kinds of things to the object, and therefore build out a set of things. In other words, if I were to add 3 meshes to this, 3 components to it, then I can set up my door. And that should be the first thing we do. So I'm going to select the meshes that the door uses. And you can easily do that if you just select the door in the level, right click, find in content browser, or Ctrl B. And then it instantly selects it in the content browser. While the object is selected in the content browser, as it is, go back to the component view over here, and then you can see on the left it says add component. You have a lot of different types, but in this case we want to add a static mesh, and you can see it already has the mesh we have selected in the content browser assigned to it. So if I'm going to click this, I automatically get the right object. So I click that, and as you can see, if I move away here, I have one half of the door in here. I should do the same with the top of the door. So I'll do the same thing again. And I'll add it again, like so. And actually I need to do this again with this one, because I need the left side as well. And again. So now I have the 3 pieces in here, and I could move them to align it. This one should be mirrored. If you want to mirror objects, you can actually give it a negative scale. So if I type scale -1 here for X, it will mirror. Something like so. So this is now my door, but on the left side we can see it's quite a mess. First of all, it's simply called static mesh 1, 2, 3, and it also says root here. So this one is the root. Everything is attached to this one. When you're dealing with components, there is always one component that's top level, the root, and the other ones are attached to it. I don't want to have it like that. I want to have a neutral root, and not one of the parts of the door shouldn't be the root. So the root should be neutral, and the door, the visual door, should be attached to a neutral root. I think that's easy to work with, and I'll explain later on why. So we're going to have to change the root here and organize this a bit more. If you click on add components, what you could add is you could add something neutral. And something neutral means it could be a sprite, like an icon. That would be very neutral. So I'm looking for the sprite. Don't instantly see it right now. Or you could also add an arrow. An arrow is quite neutral as well. It's just an arrow. And also a scene component is also very much so neutral. So any one of those will do. I'm still looking for the sprite here. I might have renamed it in the newer version here. Anyhow, I'll just add a scene. There we go. You can rename things if you right click them. Rename. You can also do F2 like in Windows. I'll just call it scene root, and you can see it's not a root yet. So what you can do is you can click and drag to the root, and if you click and drag things on other components, it will take over if it's a root, or it will attach. So if I click and drag 3 on 2, then 3 gets attached to 2. You can see if I move 2, 3 moves along with it. If you want to detach things, you can click and drag it onto its own parent. So if I click and drag 3 onto 2, it detaches again. In the same way, I'm going to detach 2 from 1. So now all 3 of them are detached, and all 3 of them are located under the scene root. There we go, we have a basic door. You can try this in the level. I can delete the 3 doors found in the level and instead add the one we have in Blueprint. So I go to the Blueprint one I have over here. I can click and drag this in, and you can see I instantly have my door. Next up, I need to animate it. I'm gonna delete the trigger actually here, and then we should animate it. So we go back here, we go to the graph, because in the graph is where you're gonna be working, and you need an event. So I'm gonna start simple with the event again. I'm simply gonna call it begin play, just to make sure it works for now. So this is similar to the level blueprint, but then we need to improve upon what we earlier did in here, because the problem we had in here was that we had to manually type in the location of the mesh, and that's not very nice at all. So what we can do here instead is we can use relative location instead of world location. You can see on the left side in the variable list, we now have variables for the 3 objects, for the 3 components we have. So every time we make a component, we have 4 of them here, it will automatically show up in the variables list here. So if you want to make this part of the door do something, this is static mesh 1, we can drag static mesh 1 here into the graph and then do something on that. So I'm going to start with static mesh 1, and we're going to do not set world location, which is what we did earlier, but set relative location. Because as you can see, the relative location of this door, you can see the locations here. These are not the locations in the world, these are the locations relative to the scene root, and this is why I want to have a separate scene root. The scene root's location, it's 0, 0, 0 here, but the scene root's location once placed in the level is the number as given here, so that's that. However, the relative location of one of its child components is still 0, 0, 0 or whatever other low value, but it's not actually following the same, it's not world location. And because of that, it's much easier to animate that, because we simply need to animate the relative location, the location this has relative to the location of the scene root, to animate the door, and that relative location is always the same no matter where we place the door. Therefore, we will never ever have to update those numbers again once we do it once. Good, so we need to start out with the default relative location of the door. The default relative location of this door is actually simply 0, 0, 0. So that's easy. And I need the same setup here, so I'm going to use a lerp again. So default start position is 0, 0, that's easy, and it should move to B. So what I wanted to move to is, let's say I wanted to move to here. And you can see now it's, I don't know why that became not 0, but it's now 234. So I'm going to simply type 234 when it was on that one. Yeah, it was that one. So x234, the other one 0. We add a timeline here as well. And here's one very particular reason why you want to use timelines and not matinee. Because people coming from Unreal Engine 3, they seem quite set on using matinees for everything they want to do. It's best if you forget about matinees and really stick to just timelines. Because for example, if you have a separate object like we have over here, it's much harder to do with a matinee. Because as mentioned, a matinee no longer exists in here. If I right click here and I try to find a matinee, doesn't, mistyped it, but it doesn't exist. Okay, so if we have a blueprint that's standing on its own, not connected to the level, we can't even actually get the matinee in here to animate the door. So you pretty much only have one option, which is to use a timeline. So definitely get the hang out of timelines. I added the timeline again. I'll quickly set it up in the same way as we've done before. I have a track there. I set it up to the first one to 0 and 0, and the second one to 5 seconds and 1. And also if you have this, you can press these two buttons here. This makes the line fit the view, which is quite easy. See, so it instantly rescales to the right size. As you can see here also, you don't want to be scrolling and dragging and all that. You simply want to press the two buttons and move forward. And also it should be mentioned about the timeline is it says length here in seconds. This is how long it takes. So if the door should take 4 seconds, for example, instead of 5, I can type 4 here. You can see this lighter gray part becomes smaller. And I move this to 4 seconds. And if you're interested about doing this a little bit better, you can also right click and change the way the line works. So if I set it to cubic auto, it becomes a bit curved, which could be nice to add a bit of extra complexity to the animation. Okay, so I have this set up. There we go, I have track 2, I connect it there, and I connect this to updated. And now I have the same as I had on the level, except I will never have to change these numbers ever again. Even if I place this door 50 times, it will always work. Let's try. And you can see the door opens. And I can easily copy the entire door now, so I can have it twice. I can even rotate the door, because this is the relative location. Relative location means it's also relative to its rotation. Therefore, even rotating the door won't make a difference. And now both doors open. I'll very quickly set it up for the other two door halves as well. And in this case, you can see the start location of the upper piece is actually 629. And I wanted to go from 629 to about 868. So it should go from 629 to 828. And now the door is set up. If I play this, all three halves open. In the same way, we can set up a pressure plate. So the pressure plate is eventually going to have to be triggered by the weight of the object that's on top of it, and it should be able to combine different objects together to increase the weight on it. We're going to start very simple here. I'm simply going to build a pressure plate that simply responds to the player. So it will go down if the player steps on it, and it will go back up if the player goes off it. The pressure plate is very much so very similar to this, so it's more repetition than anything new. It's more rehearsing what we've just learned. So I'll therefore also set it up quite fast. I'll right click, new blueprint again, based on actor, called pressure plate for tutorial. Find the mesh for the pressure plate located in runes, meshes, interactive. And then there's something called pressure plate here. This one, pressure pad base, actually. So I have that selected in there. I'll add static mesh. So now we have the mesh here. Actually, it's root again, so let me quickly add another scene component to it. To add some complexity to it, there is a number of wheels actually here. Because you can see there's 5 holes in the pressure plate, 1 big in the middle and 4 smaller ones. I'm simply going to do the one in the middle, but feel free to do the smaller ones as well. So I'll take the center disc here and add that one as well. And in this case, I'm actually going to make sure it's attached to the pressure mesh itself. Because what's going to happen is that the pressure plate in itself is going to move down when you step on it. And then this should move along, obviously. This shouldn't stay behind, it should follow the mesh it's attached to. So I really want to make sure it's attached to it, like so. And while the mesh moves down, this wheel, this disc is meant to spin around. In this case, we don't actually want to start with begin play because it should respond to when the player steps on it. So I need to have a trigger. And I can't place a trigger in the level either, because then that would mean every time I have a pressure plate I would have to attach a trigger to it. So what I do instead is I will add a trigger as a component. So in a component list you have something called box. That box can act as a trigger. So I'll add a box to it. I'll rescale that. It says box extend here. So I'm going to rescale it until it's about the size of the pressure plate. Like so, 96 is about correct. And I also make sure that is attached to the pressure mesh itself, because again the trigger should move down with the mesh as well. It's not 100% necessary, but I'm going to do it anyway. Trigger, name it something, trigger for pressure, not the best name ever, but it works. And then I can go to the graph. You can see we have all the things we added in the components here on the left side, and I can take the what I can do is actually, I don't even actually have to use the trigger for pressure. I could do that. I could use this to assign an event. And then we want to have an event for when you touch the trigger. So what I can do then is I need to have something like begin overlap. So event actor begin overlap. But that one would respond to everything. It would respond to anything overlapping, anything related to this. So it would also respond to this mesh going into the ground, then it would overlap with the ground. So in order to work around that, I want to have an overlap event for just one of the components. Now I could take trigger for pressure here, and do like this, and then it says assign event dispatcher, and then you can do assign on component begin overlap, but this quickly gets rather complex. There's an easier way if you just go to components, and then we right click the trigger, and then it says add event. You can also find this section somewhere over here at the bottom. I believe it should say somewhere here, add event, same kind of menu. So add an event for add on component begin overlap and one for end overlap. So we want to be able to check when something enters this box and when something leaves the box. So I'll add that. That instantly goes back to the graph and adds this one. You can see it's a begin overlap for trigger pressure. I'll do the same again then for the end overlap. There we go. Then I need to set up the basic motion, so the downwards movement, and the little wheel on top, the little disc on top should spin. So I'm going to quickly do that first. This is very much so similar to what we've done before. So a timeline. And I'll get two things here. So this is the disc and this is the mesh. I'll do the mesh first. We do relative location again. So when pressed it will go 32 units down. And we also have the disc in the middle, so I'll get that as well. That shouldn't get a location set because it will move along with the plate anyway, but it should have its rotation set instead. So I'll do set relative rotation. Now what I'm doing usually is I'm using you can see this uses rotation value. This is basically a vector as well, except it's a rotation vector, but it's otherwise really very much so the same. It's just 3 different decimal numbers. Anyhow, we do a lerp on this instead, which is a different type of lerp than this one. Usually do that much because if I then have to tweak the I'll have it spin say 360 degrees when it moves down, and I'll use the same alpha. This should work for triggering it, however it will never go back. So what I can do then instead is I can use reverse here, and I can do not begin overlap but end overlap. So on event actor end overlap, reverse. Therefore it also reverses this. Let's try how that works. I'm gonna add it to the level here. The disk should have rotation set local relative rotation, set relative rotation. Same thing there, we need a lerp for the rotation. You can see it's a rotation vector, still a vector in a way. The engine doesn't treats it differently, it doesn't say it's a vector. You can see this is an orange yellow thing, that's a vector. This is a rotation vector, but it's very much so exactly the same thing, just a different color. And I'll say 360 degrees on Z. So when it's activated, it will spin 360 degrees as it moves down. Good, so then I have this. And then we want to have an event for when you touch the trigger. So what I can do then is I need to have something like begin overlap. So event actor begin overlap, but that one would respond to everything. It would respond to anything overlapping, anything related to this. So it would also respond to this mesh going into the ground, then it would overlap with the ground. So in order to work around that, I want to have an overlap event for just one of the components. Now I could take trigger for pressure here, and do like this, and then it says assign event dispatcher, and then you can do assign on component begin overlap, but this quickly gets rather complex. There's an easier way if you just go to components, and then we right click the trigger, and then it says add event. You can also find this section somewhere over here at the bottom. I believe it should say somewhere here, add event, same kind of menu. So add an event for add on component begin overlap and one for end overlap. So we want to be able to check when something enters this box and when something leaves the box. So I'll add that. That instantly goes back to the graph and adds this one. You can see it's a begin overlap for trigger pressure. I'll do the same again then for the end overlap. There we go. Then I need to set up the basic motion, so the downwards movement, and the little wheel on top, the little disc on top should spin. So I'm going to quickly do that first. This is very much so similar to what we've done before. So a timeline, and I'll get two things here. So this is the disc and this is the mesh. I'll do the mesh first. We do relative location again. In here we add a float again. I'll make it just 1 second, 2 points, 0, 0. Now, what I'm doing usually is I'm using a float. I could actually make a vector as well. So I could actually have a vector in here and then directly animate this vector. Then I can also directly connect that to here. But I don't usually do that much, because if I then have to tweak the for example the speed or the location or all that, I will always have to go back into the curve editor and change these points over here, and I think that's more annoying to do than simply being able to change the number directly in here via a lerp. So that's the reason why I usually stick to this kind of setup. So I'm more easily able to simply type -16. If -60 doesn't work, I can simply type -18, -19, etc. instead of always having to go in here and then like slightly move these lines. The disk should have rotation set local relative rotation, set relative rotation. Same thing there, we need a lerp for the rotation. You can see it's a rotation vector, still a vector in a way. The engine doesn't treats it differently, it doesn't say it's a vector. You can see this is an orange yellow thing, that's a vector. This is a rotation vector, but it's very much so exactly the same thing, just a different color. And I'll say 360 degrees on Z. So when it's activated, it will spin 360 degrees as it moves down. Good, so then I have this. And then I can connect this to play and the other one to reverse. Therefore, if you step onto the trigger, it will play, and for as long as you're inside the box, it will continuously play, meaning by the time it reaches the end of its life, it will stop playing anyway, so you don't see the pressure plate going down endlessly. And if you step out of the trigger, it will reverse again. Now in this version of the engine I found a bug that prevents this from working correctly even while it should though. So in order to work around that problem, and again this might have been fixed in the future, but what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to go to components, and on the pressure mesh I'm going to turn off the collision for the player. So you have a section here, collision, it says collision presets, it says block all dynamic. I'm going to set that to ignore only pawn, so it ignores the player, so the player will actually walk through it. Because apparently there is a bug that if you stand on an object that moves while you're inside a trigger volume, the trigger volume will no longer be able to detect the player, therefore it will untrigger. Very strange bug. Seems quite recent as well. So again, I simply remove the collision of this so the player walks through it, and then it seems to detect the player correctly for now. I would hope that I will fix that in the future, but let's try this in game. See, if I step onto it, it goes down and the wheel in the middle spins. I take a step back and it goes back up. So I have a pressure plate. The next step would be to connect that to the door. So if you step on this, the door should open, and if you step back off, the door should close. So the door should stay in sync with the motion of the pressure plate. Now, because these are two different objects, you can see this is a blueprint and this is a blueprint. The door is a blueprint, pressure plate is a blueprint. We can't just connect the two. I mean, the two don't exist in the level blueprint. See, it's empty here, and we seemingly have no way of making this communicate with that. There's a number of different ways you can do it. For one, you can add a property to this one that makes it send an event to the other one. That would work. But what you can also do is we can use the level blueprint to tie these two together. And that's what I usually do myself. I usually use the level blueprint kind of as the paste between different separate blueprints. So while the separate blueprints have most of the functionality, it's the level blueprint that controls when which separate blueprint will be activated. That's kind of the Kismet approach. Adding a property into this one to open the door directly, that's kind of the Unreal Engine 1 and 2 approach. So you can do either way. I'm going to demonstrate both. So I'm going to start with actually making this directly activate the door. And in order for that to do that, I need to have an event in the door. I need to have an event in the door anyway, no matter what I do. I need to have some way of making the door understand it should start. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to open up the door again. And you can see here it says begin play. That's obviously not very good. I'm going to remove begin play. And instead I'm going to add two events. One for play, one for reverse. I'm going to add a custom event. I'm going to right click, add custom event. A custom event allows you to add an event with a name, with whatever name you want. I'm going to call it open door. And I'll add a second one called custom event close door. Close door. Like so. So I have two events here, and I can trigger these two events from other places then. You can also trigger these two events directly from in here. So because I now added a custom event, I could actually right click and type open door, and you can see it now allows for reference to open door. So that goes there. So in fact I could do this, close door instead. Close door, and I can connect close door to finished. That way, when it's done, when it's finished, it will automatically execute this one in turn, and it will reverse. So the door will open and then close by itself. Let's try that first to begin with, before we move on. We don't really need that though, so I'll remove that again. So then we have this, that's good. I'll save that. I'll go back to the pressure plate. And in the pressure plate, I need to be able to reference the door in here. Now I can't in any way get the door in here. I can't do what I do for the level blueprint, so I can't select the door, right click in here. You can see it doesn't allow you to add anything. So what I need to do instead is I need to be able to get a property in the list over here for the pressure plate. So when I click the pressure plate, I want to have a line here that says define the door or link to the door. And then that way I should be able to reach the door. To do that, I need to add a new property. That means I need a new variable. So I'll go to the left side here in the pressure plate, click new variable. I'll call it linked door, for example, just to have a name. And I need to set the type for this. So you can see it says here at the bottom, variable type. It's a bool right now. It shouldn't be a bool. It should be an actor. So I'm simply going to say it's an actor. So basically it could be anything really. Or actually we can probably do this even faster if I were to type directly get the door here. Door for tutorial. That works even better. And then I click the eye on the right of it. So if you click the eye, it will show up in the list of properties. If I don't click it and I compile it, and I look here, I can't see what I just made. I can't see the property linked door. But if I click the eye on the right of it, and then compile to update the script, you can see it now. It says here linked door. So I've now added something to it. I could have done the same thing with, for example, let's just add something to it just as a test. Here's something called new variable. It's a float. I expose it. And you can see it now shows up over here. I can set it over there. So let me remove that again. Good. The property is available. I then need to link the door. You can simply find it in here. There we go. Or I could have done the following. I could have locked the panel, because if I click a new object, the properties here update for the object I have selected. But if I click the little lock button over here in the very top right, it no longer loses the properties if I select something new. So then I can click on the door while the property here is still in view, and I can do use selected, and that also links it there. Okay, so now this understands where the door is located, and because this now understands where the door is located, I can drag get door in here, and then I can make this execute the two custom events. So you can see when I type door, I also get close door and open door, which are the two events I made in here. So it actually sees the custom events of other blueprints and allows you to call on them. If I execute this, it will execute open door in the other blueprint. So let's try that. I'm going to add it here in the beginning, actually, before the timeline even. And in the same way, I need a close door. Let's see what that does. So you can see if I step on the pressure plate, the door opens. I step off the pressure plate, the door closes again. So I have a working door system there. So that's one way of doing it. Again, you can also do it separately. You can also do it via the level blueprint. It doesn't really matter which of the two you do. It's more preference, and it's more for, perhaps in a way you could say that if you use the level blueprint, it allows you to edit it more. It allows you more control. Because if you use the level blueprint, you know exactly when it happens, and you can therefore also easily activate other things. For example, if you step on the pressure plate in this level, then the color of the level changes, or the temperature drops, or a particle gets activated. You can do all kinds of other things. If you do it solely via a property like I've done here, you don't know when this happens, because it all happens completely internally between these two objects. The level blueprint doesn't know when these two things occur. So because of that, it would be harder to embed further functionality into it. So you could say that it's a drawback, but again, it really depends on what you're doing. So I'm going to keep these two in. We definitely need those, but I'm going to remove from the pressure plate the connection I just made. And instead, I'm going to have the pressure plate call on the level, and then have the level call on the door. So I'll move these here, just in case I ever need them again. And then in order for this to call on the level, I need to have an event dispatcher. So event dispatchers are mostly, at least that's how I use it, are mostly used for making objects, separate blueprints, communicate with the level blueprint. I don't really use them for much else. So event dispatcher, let's make a new event dispatcher, let's call it tell level pressure plate is down, say. And actually I need a second one to tell the level pressure plate is up. For example, again, there's multiple ways of doing this. You can also actually make a bool and have the level extract a bool from this pressure plate and so on. There's many different solutions. Then click and drag the two into the graph. You get a menu calling for what you want to do with it. Go for call. And we also call this one, so we have both of them here. The up one should go actually here and down here, so when you step onto the pressure plate it goes down. So the level is informed it's going down. And when you step off it, it goes back up. So we have this. And then when you compile it, make sure it's compiled, otherwise the level blueprint won't know it exists. Select the door in the level. Go to the level blueprint, select the pressure plate in the level, go to the level blueprint, which is this one, and now while you have the pressure plate selected, these two events now show up over here. So I can get both of them here. So that's down, this is up, and then I can make those in turn tell the door, so I select the door in the level to activate something over there. So you can see while I have the door selected and I right click, it also shows closed door and open door there. So I'll get both of those in. So when the pressure plate is up, the door should actually close and now it should open. So it's the other way around. Let's try that. And you can see that also works. The door opens, I'm standing on the pressure plate, I step off, it closes, I step back on, it opens, etc. So again, the same result, different way of doing it. And as mentioned, now I can actually add other things to it as well. The particle and, for example, the light we added earlier on. Now I can actually say, okay, we have this light here. Let's activate that. Set visibility when the door opens and when the door closes, turn off the light. So by having it in here, it allows us for adding more complexity to it, having more control, because we can intercept the signal and do something else with it before it opens the door.